what I was thinking too.
Albert Walker thought that he had committed the perfect murder and that he was going to get away with it scot-free.
He was very charming, very engaging.
He was good. He was very good.
It was almost perfect.
It sounds like they're trying to like high-five this murder, like, it's like, yeah, he fucking killed my wife and he almost got away with it, that bloody good bloke. It was almost perfect.
5 a.m., Brixham Harbour in Devon. Two fishermen are getting ready to start work. Their first haul is disappointing, so they sail another 6 miles out to an area rarely fished, known as the Roughs. The nets are weighted down to make them sink to the seabed, so they'll catch everything floating above. After about an hour, they start to haul in. A man's body falls out with the fish.
Brixham Coast Guard, this is a fishing...
The discovery of the body was to be the start of an extraordinary investigation involving an international conman with a string of false identities. But at first, the Devon and Cornwall police thought they were dealing with a tragic accident.
The body was in remarkably good condition for being in the salt water. It was dressed in a long-sleeve shirt, trousers, brown shoes. It had no identification on it at all. He was wearing a Rolex wristwatch. It showed a time and a date, the date being the 22nd. His pockets were turned out as if someone had got there before me and searched the pockets before me.
Was a fisher dude, was he? Was a fisherman?
He might have fallen off a boat going up the channel, and we get an awful lot of boats going up the channel, but nobody was reported as missing at the time.
The well-preserved condition of the body suggested that it hadn't been in the sea for long. The post-mortem revealed several injuries, including a deep gash on his head.
When you're trawling a net in and you're lifting that trawl onto deck, there is a large possibility that that head injury could have been caused then.
The only distinguishing mark found at the post-mortem was an unusual tattoo on the back of the man's right hand.
I tried to work out what the tattoo was, but it had slightly smudged over the period of time. And my initial thought was that it was a cluster of stars.
But the best clue to his identity came from his watch.
Purely by chance, my officer was talking to another police officer who said, well, if it's a Rolex watch...
Hold on, so was this dude that they found also a fisherman? Or is he just like some random guy?
If it's a genuine Rolex, it'll have a serial number. So he spoke to Rolex in London, who said, if it has been sent for service, we might be able to tell you where it's come from.
They were able to tell us that, in fact, the watch had been serviced on a couple of occasions in a jeweller's in Yorkshire for a guy called Mr. Ronald Joseph Platt.
Yeah, I don't think a fucking fisherman.
Finally, they were able to identify the dead man.
Without the Rolex watch, we would not have known who the body was, we wouldn't have been able to identify, and I would have had to return an open verdict.
Eventually, we managed to track his...
See, that was the mistake. It was perfect up until the watch.
last known address down as to a place in Essex.
Ronald Platt had been a tenant at this house in Chelmsford. When the local police contacted the landlord, he put them in touch with the man Ron had given as a personal referee when he moved in, a Mr. D. Davis.
I phoned Mr. Davis, introduced myself. I was reluctant to tell him the reason for my call. I didn't want to be telling him that his friend was dead, but ultimately he forced me to. I was obliged to tell him. Difficult to judge a person's reaction over the telephone, but he didn't seem particularly shocked or taken aback, and he didn't ask too many questions.
David Davis agreed to meet the police to give them background information on Ronald Platt.
That's a vibe check fail.
David Davis was a very nice man, very amiable, very self-assured, dressed very well but casually, but you could tell that the clothes were expensive. He had the bearing of a man who knew what he was doing, very confident. I couldn't work out what nationality he was.
Bullshit. This guy looks like he's killed someone before. Don't give me that. Look at this. Look at his eyes. He definitely did it.
And he didn't say, and I'd assumed
Case
he was
closed,
American.
baby.
We sat down and talked for a little while, and he told me how he'd loaned Ron money to set himself up in France, in business in France, and that he, as far as he was aware, he'd gone.
Curious.
We spoke about the tattoo on the back of Ron's hand, and he said
dead.
that was a Canadian maple leaf. He said he was sure he had a photograph of Ron, and he would dig it out for me and forward it. A few days later, David Davis sent me through a photograph. It was Ron, circled, and this is Ron.
Man.
As far as I was concerned, that was the end of the Essex side of the inquiry.
Ron Platt had probably fallen overboard and drowned. It was an unfortunate accident. There were just a few last formalities before the case could be closed.
I wanted to speak to Mr. Davis and he wasn't answering his mobile phone, so I requested a colleague in Essex Police, DS Peter Redman, to attend Mr. Davis's address and ask him to contact me.
I'd never been to the village, let alone the street before. It's very rural, and there's only 4 houses in the street, and none of them have got names on. So I went to the first pair and just knocked at the first door. Elderly couple answered, and I said, I'm looking for Little London Farmhouse. They said, no, this is Little London House. Little London Farmhouse is next door. Who are you looking for? And I said, David Davis. Oh no, it's not David Davis that lives there, it's Ron Platt.
David Davis was posing as his friend Ron Platt. The man police thought had accidentally.
So would an innocent man do that? Interesting. How many innocent people do you know running around as their friends as the cops are looking for a murder case? I don't know. That's some innocent behavior. That's some innocent behavior right there.
Drowned.
Nothing
They
sus.
described the person they knew as Ron Platt as the person I knew as David Davis. And so I was quite happy that we were talking about one and the same person. There was some foul play going on here somewhere. It was just a case of trying to get my head round exactly what.
Detective Sergeant Redman reported what he'd found to the Devon police.
The importance of David Davis was rising within the inquiry, and it became apparent that he possibly knew more than he was actually telling us.
The discovery that David Davis had stolen his dead friend's identity was down to pure chance. And it sparked an investigation that was to take them 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, and 2 years of painstaking detective work to solve the mystery of Ron Platt's death. Ronald Platt's body had been dredged up by a trawler off the Devon coast. The police went to visit his friend David Davis, but by chance went to the wrong house and uncovered the double life of a man they thought was innocently helping them with their inquiries.
I often reflected on
Even across the seas.
why I'd gone to the wrong house.
Even across the seas, the police are fucking useless. They got lucky that they found this guy. Lucky. Oh, alright, continue.
What would have happened had I gone to the right one and he'd been there? Had he been there, I'd have given him the message and then I'd come away. I'd have spoken to David Davis as far as I knew, and that would have been the end of it.
Instead, Detective Sergeant Redman went back again to question the next-door neighbours about Davis and his family.
Frank and Audrey, the elderly couple there, told me how they'd moved in some time ago. There was Ron and his much younger wife and two very small children, a baby in arms and a toddler of about 3. They said that there was a connection with Devon because they understood that he had a boat that he used to sail regularly.
But without its name and a description to go on, the police couldn't find the boat.
Everyone had been
How's my
sent
audio?
out to re-interview witnesses to see
How's that mic? Is that sounding alright?
whether they could add any little tiny detail which could make a difference to the inquiry.
They started with the fisherman who'd found Ron Platt's body.
He informed us that in fact there was an anchor that had been trawled up in that same trawl, which he'd given to a friend of his. We traced that friend, and the friend informed us that he'd given the anchor to his mother to sell at a car boot sale in Brixham. Luckily for us, the anchor hadn't sold at the car boot sale and it was still languishing in the garage of his mother, and we were able to take possession of that, complete with the price label still on for the car boot sale.
At the time, the police had no idea of the significance of the anchor, but it was to become a key piece of evidence. For now, they needed to find out more about the history of David Davis's friendship with Ron Platt.
Ronald's brother informed us that
Significance of the anchor, but it was to become a key piece of evidence.
It's just like, as a cop, how do you not look at this guy and just be like, yeah, this is a fucking vibe check fail. We need to do some more investigation. Instead, they're like, yeah, dude, this dude's a fucking ice cold killer, even on the heist. Damn. But honestly,
For now, they needed to find out more about the history of David Davis's friendship with Ron Platt.
Ronald's
Yeah,
brother
that only
informed
heisted
us that he had a long-standing ex-girlfriend, Elaine Boyce, who lived in the Harrogate area. It wasn't until we'd spoken to Elaine that we started to uncover Ronald Platt the man and exactly how he lived his life.
Ron and Elaine had lived together for 10 years, until 1993.
He was very quiet, he was very calm, he was a very gentle fellow, and he was just lovely. He was just a very caring, came across as a very warm and caring man.
Elaine had photographs she'd taken of Ron wearing the Rolex watch.
Well, Ron's main treasured possession was his watch. He was crazy about electronics and precision engineering. He always wore it all the time, even in the shower. When the police spoke to me about Ron's death, they explained basically that they'd found his body. I just thought, you know, it's such a shame, it's such a waste, and I just felt lost, really. I couldn't believe it.
As well as telling the police about Ron, she could also explain their connection with David Davis. Elaine had met him 5 years earlier in Harrogate, when he'd walked into the Fine Art Auctioneers where she was working as a receptionist.
It was a very quiet day because I remember the telephone didn't ring and this man was there for about an hour and a half talking to me about, well, initially talking about the auction room and paintings and antiques. He was very tall, very broad, very charming, very engaging. He was almost perfect. Conversation moved into what he was doing. That he was moving up to Yorkshire and was looking for somewhere to live near Harrogate in the Dales.
Dude, she totally wants that guy. The way she's talking about him. Yeah, she's definitely swooning right now.
And then, unbelievably, at the end of the conversation, he offered me a job. I thought, it's just amazing. But then, at the back of my mind, I knew that I wouldn't be working for this man for very long, because Ron and I were going to be going off to Canada. And he said, you know, that's fine. He said, I'll be able to help you save up to go to Canada, because I'll offer you more money than you're earning here.
He became friends with the couple.
A toupee.
Ron's relationship with Mr. Davis was
like
instant,
you know,
instantly hitting.
Those hair pieces that, you know, balding guys have to wear. That you put on top of your head. It's like that, what Trump wears on top of his head.
It off. Within a few minutes of talking after they first met, Ron, I could tell, was
Like a
bowled
bald
over by
cap.
this man.
David Davis moved quickly and offered them a share in his new company.
The opposite
The
of a
name of
bald
the
cap.
company was Cavendish Corporation, which sounded very, very grand.
Cap for bald people. I don't know. How do
He made Ron and I directors of his company, and he explained that he didn't want to be a director because, well, he went into explanations about his wife, that his wife was chasing him for alimony, and he didn't want his name on any of the paperwork. He said she was a very eminent GP in New York, and he explained that she had lots of money and she was successful, and this was his money and she was after it, she was greedy. This was his explanation, and I believed it, you know, I did believe it.
Elaine's job was to travel to Europe and view properties.
Of course she did.
None of them was ever bought. And while she was away, she deposited money for her boss in his foreign bank accounts.
Looking back in reflection, he drew Ron and I into his own little world, you know, in setting up the business and travelling to Europe and looking at properties and having this company that was just a facade, really.
But at the time,
Yeah,
Elaine
she's
never
definitely
questioned
wearing a
Davis's
toupee.
respectability.
The hairline.
Everybody said nice things, the same sort of things that I believed, and thought everybody thought he was a very nice gentleman. He got involved with the local Harrogate Baptist Church. He seemed very religious. He often talked about God. If somebody's religious, you trust them, you believe in them.
What kind of metric test is that? If you're religious, I just instantly believe you now. That is the worst fucking metrics test ever. Explains why fucking pedophilia runs so fucking rampant in the church. That's how they think.
David used to worship here very regularly, most weeks. He used to come, he used to sit right down there in the same pew every week. I found him a very pleasant guy. I'd like to be able to say I had him sussed, but I just didn't. He was open, it seemed to me. He was helpful. He wanted to be supportive to other people. And I thought an all-round good egg.
Elaine and Ron were invited to spend Christmas Day 1992 with David Davis and his daughter, Noelle.
She seemed very much in awe of her father. He was the one that did all the talking generally. I mean, she did come across quite shy, but not overly shy. But she always used to look up to her father for approval.
And he gave the couple a generous gift.
In my Christmas present was a card that was a promise to purchase 2 tickets to Canada if we took them by the end of February. And that would be February 1993. And that was a shock for me because I thought, well, that's only a couple of months. How could we just suddenly up and go to Canada in such a short time? But when Ron read it, he was amazed because it was his dream, really. I said, why? Why do we need to go so quickly? And he explained that you guys want to get on with your life. Canada is where Ron wants to be. It's a golden opportunity. And he sort of sold it. He sold the idea of Canada.
And he had a suggestion about how they could remain directors of his company.
He explained that it would be sensible to have rubber stamps made of our signatures, so that when we were in Canada, he could then use these stamps to sign documents or cheques or whatever. And he also explained that it's done all the time in business, so it didn't seem like there was anything wrong in that at the time.
Ron and Elaine set off for Canada and a new life in February 1993. But Elaine didn't settle.
We didn't have a lot of money at all. I couldn't work there. Ron had difficulty at first in getting a job there, and it was hard, and it was the middle of winter, so it was a struggle.
Within 5 months, Elaine was back home to be bridesmaid at her sister's wedding. Davis, now a family friend, was invited. But when he heard that Elaine wouldn't be returning to Canada and to Ron, he wasn't happy.
You know, he sort of said how much he liked Ron and how much he didn't want us to part, and how every man deserves a second chance, and he tried his best to get me to go back, but I wouldn't go back.
Only days after the wedding, David Davis was packing up and moving out of Harrogate, and Elaine found herself...
David Davis. Can't trust a man with 2 first names, that's what they say.
abruptly cut off.
I didn't have his details, I didn't have his address, all I had was a mobile number for him. And so basically he just left.
What she didn't know was that from that moment on, he started calling himself Ronald Platt, and continued to do so for the next 3 years. Elaine had little contact with him, or her ex-boyfriend, Ron Platt, during that time. She knew that Ron had returned to the UK, but she was completely unaware that Ron's body had been dredged up in July 1996. And when Elaine last spoke to David Davis, 3 months after Ron's body had been found,
I mean, if they're
he didn't
hiding it,
mention
it's
it.
fine.
At the end of the phone call, I just happened to say, "Oh, have you heard from Ron?" And he said he hadn't heard from him since June because he'd gone to France.
It was only when she met the police that Elaine realised that David Davis had been lying to her.
In the conversation with the police, they did mention that they had spoken to Mr. Davis as part of their inquiries, and that unfortunately David said he couldn't help them. So, as a response to that, I said to the police, I said, "How long ago did you speak to Mr. Davis?" And they said, "Weeks ago." And it was that triggered in my mind instantly. I thought, there's something wrong, there's something very wrong.
David Davis, who she had only spoken to a week or so earlier, had failed to mention the fact that Ronald had been trawled up by a fishing boat in Devon.
Elaine suspected that he was involved in Ron's death. So the next time he called, she felt frightened.
I didn't know what to say because I didn't know whether I should make him aware that I knew that Ron had died. So that instantly threw me, and then I thought, well, it's best, it's best to be honest and say. So I did, and then his voice just changed, because up to that point he was upbeat, and he said, "Oh, I would like to come and see you at work."
That's sus as fuck. Nope, vibe check, get out of there, girl.
I thought, if I'm not careful, he's going to be suspicious of me, the fact that I don't want to meet him. So I agreed to meet him for a coffee. He was sort of saying things like how he'd said prayers for Ron on the way up on the train, and how...
This chick used to work for the killer. But she also knew the guy that he killed. And then I think it was David Davis or whatever. He lied about who he was.
He shed tears for Ron because of
And
Ron's death.
He also didn't tell her that he died. She had to find out from the cops. So now they're both they're gonna get coffee. She's trying to... I know, it was a pretty terrible explanation. But
and
also,
it all
I don't
seemed
remember
very
the-
shallow to me. I could almost it's like I could see that he was acting.
But she played along with him, and when he left, she rang the police. They knew that if he was travelling home by train, he would arrive at Chelmsford Station.
At that point, we decided that the inquiry was such that we would be arresting this man for murder when we could find him. We sat up at Chelmsford railway station in the anticipation of him returning. He didn't come home that night. The following morning, I decided to drive past Little London farmhouse to see if the car had returned or if there were any sign of life.
There was someone at home.
I had sat and watched the house, waiting for reinforcements. Because this man was American, somewhere along the line someone said, well, he might be armed. I'm not quite sure where that had come from, but that decision was made that it would be done, the arrest would be carried out by armed officers, on the principle that we're arresting him for murder and we know nothing of the man.
But their suspect had other plans for the day.
Allied 4, got that.
Whilst I sat there, a taxi pulled into Little London Lane.
The gentleman just came straight out. He sat in the front seat beside me, chatting away quite nicely. Just seemed like a very normal business chat, friendly, nice chat.
I followed the taxi out of Wood and Water towards Danbury and Chelmsford.
We were talking about the big house at the top of the road that was just up from where he was, when I noticed in the mirror that there was a police car coming up at very high speed behind me with his lights flashing. And I actually turned around and said to the gentleman beside me, I wasn't doing anything wrong, was I?
I noticed the armed response vehicle coming up fast behind me. Come past me, and they come past the taxi and pulled across in front of him.
And then the policeman came to the window, pointing a gun at my passenger, telling him to get out of the car.
They called Davis out of the cab and fetched him round to the back, hands onto the boot, searched him. I walked over to them and said, "Good morning, Mr. Davis. Do you remember me?" And he said, "Oh, yes." I said, "Well, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Ron Platt."
He reacted very calmly, quietly, never said a word, did exactly as the policeman told him to do.
He didn't seem angry at all. He put his hands behind his back in very compliant fashion, and they handcuffed him. There was no emotion displayed at all. He was taken to Chelmsford police station, and it was at that point when he was searched as he arrived that in one pocket he was, as far as the documentation was concerned, he was David Davis. In the other pocket, he was Ron Platt.
The police now had proof that he was using Ron Platt's identity, but this wouldn't be enough to secure a conviction for murder. Then, as they dig deeper into Davis's past, they find that they've stumbled across an international criminal on Interpol's most wanted list.
This title's a little misleading. It says an almost perfect murder, and nothing I've heard thus far leads me to conclude that this dude thought about anything, any step of the way. Like, I think he just thought because he had a lot of money that he was just gonna get away with it. Clearly that didn't work out for him.
Police had arrested David Davis for the murder of his friend Ron Platt. They were convinced Davis was guilty, but needed more evidence to charge him.
At the point of arrest, there was very little evidence that turned out to be used in court that we had at that time. The majority of the evidence was in fact gathered after arrest, and as a result of what we found during searches and further inquiries that we made.
Detective Sergeant Redmond from the Essex Police drove to Davis's house to arrest the woman they thought was his wife.
She didn't appear terribly shocked. She was more concerned with the welfare of the baby and the toddler. And while she was packing the bag for the toddler, the female officer who was with her noticed that it seemed very heavy, picked it up and looked and found a quantity of gold bars and cash.
She's about to bail.
Just what a 3-year-old needs for a night away.
And that
She's
was just the beginning.
Fail, dude. Hell yeah.
Time is 5:20 p.m. approximately on the 31st of October 1996, a Thursday, and I'm about to film Little London Farmhouse in Woodham Walter in Essex.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
They found £25,000 in cash, 8,000 Swiss francs, 17 gold bars, and paintings valued at £6,000.
The jig is up.
At that stage, we still weren't sure who we were dealing with. So documents were taken, paintings were taken, valuables were taken. Virtually the house was emptied.
Because gold holds its value, it usually goes up in value. So yeah, you just store your money as gold, and then you can sell the gold off later.
The couple were taken to Devon for questioning.
He was very calm and very helpful prior to the actual official interview, and after the official interview, he was eager to help, and his whole attitude was that of, you know, I'm going to help you. I haven't done anything wrong to this man, you know.
Even though she should have just left the gold bar, like, behind, and then just come back for them. Got a little too greedy, like, was she hoping to, like, sell the gold bars on the go? Just take the cash, you'll be fine.
This is a tragic incident.
But when the tape was switched on, all cooperation stopped.
Whilst being interviewed, he sat there and declined very politely to answer any of the questions that were put to him. We got absolutely no information from him whatsoever. So it was nose to the grindstone, and let's try and prove a connection between the death of Mr. Platt and Mr. Davis, who we had in custody.
In her bag that she was bringing with
The
her.
house search had uncovered photos of Davis's yacht, the Lady Jane, with him on board. But they couldn't find where it was moored. Then, as Essex police were going through other evidence they'd collected, there was another astonishing breakthrough.
We'd made various notes on the big board, and one of the notes was the Lady Jane. Now, the inspector in charge of the search team came into the room to be briefed and said, "Oh, what's that?" "Well, that's the name of the boat." He said, "Oh, that's down at Mayland. I'm a sailor, and I've seen that down at Mayland in dry dock." And sure enough, that's where it was. And it was transported, complete by road, to the Forensic Science Service.
They found traces of Ron Platt's blood and hair on a cushion in the cabin, and an empty carrier bag from a shop called Sport Nautique.
So she put it in the bag, she could bring it with.
A fingerprint examination was done on that. Unfortunately for us, Mr. Platt's fingerprints were found on that carrier bag.
An anchor had been bought from the shop shortly before Ron's death. The receipt was found during the house search.
We interviewed the staff at the shop who were able to tell us that it was
She
two
was surprised she
gentlemen
got
that had
caught.
come in that day and
She
purchased
just
the items.
accidentally put them in there.
But the anchor they'd bought wasn't suitable for the Lady Jane, and she already had one. It was, though, identical to the anchor trawled up with Ron Platt's body. And when the pathologist saw it, he realized its significance.
The match of the anchor with the two injuries on the dead man's leg was perfect. One look at the photograph, you can say, right, this must have been in that position when this man was dumped into sea.
The pathologist had also noticed that the leather belt that Ron Platt was wearing had a pronounced kink in it. And when it was examined, they found deposits of zinc, which matched the coating of the anchor.
I think he was hit over the head, rendering him unconscious. And then the anchor was attached to his belt. And then Davis threw Ronald Platt over the side of the boat. And Ronald Platt ended up on the bottom of the sea.
The evidence against David Davis was building, but still wasn't enough to convict him of murder.
Well, that's a good thing to do.
Thinking he was American, they sent his fingerprints to Interpol. It was a turning point in the investigation.
Within a few hours, a huge piece of news came through to say, in fact, that the man we had in custody wasn't David Davis at all, and in fact his name was Albert Johnson Walker. He was a fugitive from Canada who was wanted by them for the theft of millions and millions of dollars, and was actually on Interpol's most wanted list.
They discovered that Albert Walker had been living in Ontario with his wife, Barb, and their family. The couple split up acrimoniously, and he was arrested trying to break into the family home. A month later, in December 1990, Albert Walker, who ran an investment company, disappeared, along with $3.2 million of clients' money.
Albert Walker absconded from Canada with his daughter, Sheena. It was the understanding by the Walker family that they were going on a vacation, a skiing vacation. Eventually, when they didn't return in a reasonable amount of time, especially with Barb Walker, it was panic. She became very, very worried about the safety of her daughter.
A missing persons photograph of Sheena, who was 15 at the time, was circulated worldwide.
Mr. Walker, we knew, had traveled to England and then to Switzerland. And at that point, the trail had gone cold, so we really had no idea where Mr. Walker was.
That was because Albert Walker had assumed his first false identity. He became David Davis, a man who'd been an investor in his company.
I think originally he used a false identity of David Davis, possibly just to get out of Canada and live as his first port of call in England. Once that identity had run its course, he needed someone else, and I don't think that he could believe his luck when he stumbled across Elaine Boyes and Ronald Platt.
The police were starting to unravel Albert Walker's web of deceit. He'd met Ron and his girlfriend Elaine after moving to Harrogate in 1991. Within 18 months, he'd befriended them, made them directors of his bogus company, and paid for them to emigrate to Canada. Next, he moved 300 miles south to Devon, with his new identity and his new wife. When Judith DeMarti put an ad in the local paper for a cottage to rent, it was a Mr. and Mrs. Ron Platt who contacted her.
He turned
God
up
damn,
with
like, how
his very
many
pregnant
fucking
wife
identities does this guy have?
and loved the cottage, loved the location, said it was just what they were looking for.
They moved into the middle of a row of cottages just across the yard from the farmhouse where Judith and her sister Carol lived.
He did come over as a slightly exaggerated character, and I'd put that down, I think, to perhaps keeping up with a young wife. The dyed hair and the very expensive dental job, which I noticed almost immediately, and the rather youthful clothes for a man of his age gave me the impression that he was trying to keep up with a young wife.
Ron was an amateur artist who displayed his work at home, even when it gave a clue to his past life as David Davis.
My daughter, who was studying art at the time, remarked about a painting that he kept on an easel. He said that it was one of his paintings, and she remarked on the fact that it was signed David, and he said, oh, that was a name they used to call me when I was at college. But we thought nothing of it at the time.
The baby arrived in September 1993, and they continued to live at Kestrel Cottage, posing as husband and wife for another year.
There was an occasion when we were in conversation and she called Ron Daddy. It left a mark. I noticed it, but didn't altogether think it odd. It seemed to me to be a term of affection, I suppose, really. I can't really speculate on what roles they played when we weren't there, but I have to say that they were very, very convincing. It never occurred to me at any time that they weren't husband and wife. Never did that enter my mind. And I think I went into shock when I found that in fact they weren't.
One evening he spoke to Carol about a new business idea he was considering.
He was interested in marriage guidance counselling, and he asked me if I knew of any centres of counselling where he could take classes, and I recommended one or two. And over a period of months he attended. It would have been a very basic qualification. I have to say that I was quite surprised when he started talking about setting up his own counselling centre.
At the end of 1994, they moved again, this time east to Essex, where the police were eventually to catch up with him. Here, the fake Ronald Platt was exaggerating his qualifications to friends he made at the local tennis club.
He did say he was a psychologist and he was working somewhere near Brentwood, but that really was as far as he wanted to go. And so I told him that there were a number of medical people who were members of the club who played tennis, and I offered to introduce him, and he wasn't quite so keen on that. I found him quite friendly and quite likeable.
Finally free.
His wife, on the other hand, she was extremely young, surprisingly, probably less than half his age, and she was quite the opposite. She never spoke. In fact, when I spoke to her or asked her a question, she always looked to him for permission to answer the question, and I found that was very, very strange.
The family lived in Essex for 2 years, and another child was born there. But the man locals knew as Ron Platt was about to lose control of his carefully constructed identity. In 1995, he had news from Canada. The real Ronald Platt was returning home to live in Britain.
He probably thought that by sending the genuine Ronald Platt to Canada, he could then have a lifelong identity that he could use with no comebacks. But obviously, that didn't turn out to be the case. There was now 2 people living in a very small area by the name of Ronald Platt with the same date of birth and same documents. And this was obviously a threat to his continuing freedom.
Canadian fugitive Albert Walker had plenty to hide, and a motive to murder Ronald Platt.
I think on that day, Albert Walker took Ronald Platt out.
There's just so many twists and turns in this. It's just like every 5 minutes there's a new twist. Oh, fuck. Whoops.
In fact, when I spoke to her or asked her a question, she always looked to him for permission to answer the question, and I found that was very, very strange.
The family lived in Essex for 2 years, and another child was born there. But the man locals knew as Ron Platt was about to lose control of his carefully constructed identity. In 1995, he had news from Canada. The real Ronald Platt was returning home to live in Britain.
He probably thought that by sending the genuine Ronald Platt to Canada, he could then have a lifelong identity that he could use with no comebacks. But obviously, that didn't turn out to be the case. There was now 2 people living in a very small area by the name of Ronald Platt with the same date of birth and same documents. And this was obviously a threat to his continuing freedom.
Canadian fugitive Albert Walker had plenty to hide, and a motive to murder Ronald Platt.
Yeah, it is a pretty good
I think
story.
on that day, Albert Walker took Ronald Platt out as a friend on his...
I'll say, like, yeah, the first half of this, I'm like, alright, this guy's a fucking idiot. And I mean, I'm still kind of leaning towards that. But, like, the second half, it gets more into, like, his constructed life. Or I should say lives. So, I can see how it was almost a perfect murder.
Boat, maybe for a bit of fishing, purely with the intention of taking him out there and killing him and dumping his body overboard.
I think Ron would have trusted him right till the end. I don't think he will have had any doubts or fears. Otherwise, I don't believe he would have gone on the boat. He wouldn't have gone on the boat if he didn't trust him, I'm sure.
Albert Walker was still protesting his innocence at his trial in June 1998. But the woman who everyone thought was his wife, but was actually his daughter, was about to be a key witness.
Hold on, what the fuck? So he's running around the countryside with his daughter that's pretending to be his wife that he knocked up? Okay, yeah, now this guy's just a straight piece of shit. Never mind.
In June 1998, Albert Walker went on trial for the murder of Ronald Platt. On the way into Exeter Crown Court, he hid his face, but once inside he appeared confident that the case against him wouldn't succeed.
At no time did he really think that he was in difficulty. He didn't think that anyone could prove that he had murdered this man.
No one witnessed the murder. No one was able to say, therefore, for certain where it took place or how it took place.
The Rolex watch, which helped identify Ron's body in the first place, also provided a vital clue to the time of the murder. The watch was water-resistant and self-winding, but at the bottom of the sea, and motionless, it would stop after around 48 hours.
Because the watch had stopped at 22nd day, we were able to establish that in fact it would have entered the water on around about the 20th or the 21st of July.
There were more clues to be found in the computer memory of the boat's global positioning system.
Remarkably, that was able to tell us that on the dating question that we were looking at, that Mr. Davis's boat had been out at sea in not a position far away from where Ronald Platt's body had been trawled up.
Ron's ex-girlfriend, Elaine Boyes, was called to give evidence against the man she'd known as David Davis.
I thought, I'm not going to look at him. I'm purposely not going to make any eye contact. But of course, once I was in there, I did glance. And when I looked at him, I thought how much he'd aged, and also he was grey. But he still looked like the Mr. Davis. He was very smart, very grand. It was still Mr. Davis.
Elaine's evidence was damning.
Smart and grand. She still wants him.
Because she could explain the background to their friendship and why he had a motive for murder.
Ron Platt represented a real threat to Albert Walker, because Albert Walker had been using Ron Platt's name and details, and if he had been exposed, someone would have said, who is this man who has been calling himself Ron Platt?
The prosecution also called Sheena, Albert Walker's daughter, who'd been on the run with her father for 6 years, posing as his wife, and now the mother of 2 small children.
I think as an individual, she'd come under the spell of her father and had been brainwashed into protecting him, and unfortunately she was used as a bit of a sidekick, a bit of an alibi for him in various aspects of their lives together, which is a sad thing.
When her father was arrested, Sheena returned to Canada with the children. 2 years later, she was back for the trial.
She was able to state that she hadn't been aware that Mr. Platt was in the Devon area shortly before his death.
At the time of the murder, Sheena, the children, and Albert Walker were staying in a holiday cottage in Devon.
We said that it was highly significant that the defendant had kept from his daughter that he was seeing Mr. Platt, when Mr. Platt was, of course, a friend of the family. And we said that that was entirely consistent with Mr. Walker having planned this murder, but wanting to make sure that his daughter knew absolutely nothing about it.
And Sheena couldn't give her father an alibi for the day of the murder.
One point of evidence that Sheena did give on the witness stand was that on the day in question, on the day we suspected that the murder was committed, she did confirm that her father had been out on the boat.
It had been very bad weather, and he'd come back late and wet. That, of course, wasn't strong evidence in its own right, but we said that that was important because it showed that there was a day when Mr. Walker had been on the face of it on his own at the material time and would have had the opportunity of killing Mr. Platt and disposing of the body without anyone else discovering about it.
On day 8 of the trial, it was Albert Walker's turn to take the stand.
When Albert Walker went into the witness box, it was obviously something of an electric moment.
They weren't sure whether he was going to give evidence, and I hoped and prayed that he would, because I thought to myself that if he gives evidence, people will see him for what he really is. When he was on the stand, he was very confident, very charming again, charming to the judge, very relaxed. Mr. Davis, he was the Mr. Davis that I knew.
Albert Walker obviously had a problem in presenting his case because he had to accept that he was a man on the run who was using a false identity. But at the end of the day, he had to accept that and essentially said, well, yes, I've done things that I shouldn't have done, but I wasn't the murderer.
He admitted on the stand that Ron may have been murdered, but it wasn't him. You know, there's no way it was him. So he thought he would get away with it.
And he gave his explanation for the evidence of Ron Platt's blood on cushions in his yacht.
He said that Mr. Platt had in some way knocked his head during the course of an incident on the boat,
Yeah,
but that had nothing to do with anyone falling off the side of the boat, let alone a murder.
But for once, Albert Walker failed to convince his audience. The jury took just 2 hours to find him guilty of Ron Platt's murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment.
And when I heard the verdict, I felt relief. I felt elation. I was so happy that he hadn't got away with it.
But Ron Platt's murder had so nearly remained undetected.
Albert Walker was extremely close to getting away with it because the chances of trawling up a body within 7 days of it having been put in the water in an area not very often fished was extremely remote.
Had it not been for the Rolex watch with its unique number on Ron Platt's wrist, had it not been that the anchor by chance was picked up, had it not indeed been for the fact that an officer went to a wrong house by mistake and discovered that Albert Walker was using a false name, the police would simply have closed the inquiry, said we've found out who Mr. Platt is, and that would have been the end of the matter.
Albert Walker's trail of deception and false identities had fooled most people most of the time.
I still find it hard to believe that someone that could be portrayed to be such a nice, kind person could have done this. In fact, I know that there are people that don't believe it, that still refuse to accept that this has happened. It's like, oh, it can't have been him.
He was good. He was very good, doing all that he did and passing himself off here. I don't know anyone who I've spoken to here who had any particular doubts about it.
Essentially,
I find it very difficult to reconcile.
If the police hadn't fucked up so badly, we would have never caught him. Yeah, good police work right there.
The Ron that I knew and was fond of, with the man that was in the dock, the man that they were saying all these things about. And it wasn't that I didn't believe that he was guilty, as indeed he was proved to be. It was just that I couldn't reconcile those two people.
In February 2005, Walker was returned to Canada to serve the rest of his sentence.
Canadian?
In all the time that Walker was in police custody and during the trial, he has never shown any remorse for what he's done to Ronald Platt. And I think to this day, he still shows no remorse.
He used me as a front for his business, betrayed my trust, and ultimately he murdered somebody that I cared very deeply about and spent a lot of my life with. And you can't forgive that, can you? It's just pure evil.
Can't forgive.